May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
So over the 4th of July week, a little bit over a week ago, I think it was actually a week ago from yesterday, my family, we stopped at my parents' house in Athens, Georgia for dinner. My mom had kind of invited the whole extended family over. And one of my cousins was there that night who had grown up in the small town of Winder, Georgia. This is about 20 miles away from Athens. And so when I was growing up, my family, we went to church at St. Anthony's Episcopal Church over in Winder, Georgia, along with like my uncle and my cousins and my grandmother, the whole family. And so I'm talking to my cousin there at dinner, and he said, "You have got to go and listen to this podcast called In the Red Clay." So on the drive back to Athens, we listened to In the Red Clay. And I've been listening to it all week. It's like watching a train wreck or something. I can't quit. But it's about the organized crime group in the South in the late 60s, early 70s. They called themselves the Dixie Mafia. And so these were moonshiners, drug dealers. They robbed banks. They robbed anything they could find, and they killed anyone who got in their way. And it turns out that they were based right there in Winder, Georgia. The leader was a man from Winder whose name was Billy Sunday Burt. And he is one of, he's little known, but he's one of the most ruthless and really evil killers in all of U.S. history. From 1970 to 1974, it's estimated that he killed between 52 and 56 people. And a lot of these killings, this podcast, they were gruesome killings, torture. So listener discretion is advised. It's a graphic and for mature audiences. And so I'm listening to this, and they're talking about the places and the roads and the farms that I know, that I grew up around. One of the people interviewed in this podcast was in the very same graduating class in high school as one of my uncles, and he's describing how his father was a DA and blown up. And so I got to thinking about how all of this evil stuff was going on at the very same time and in the very same small town as my parents were in while they were kind of helping to start up this new fledgling Episcopal church. And it kind of really hit me. They were right there. Billy Burt was running around robbing and killing people on an epic scale. And then there's this little church I grew up in that was literally at the same time starting up a food pantry next door. And it really just it hit home how close and how these horrific acts were right there next to this place that I experienced God's grace, God's love, probably for the first time in my life in that little church. These two were side by side. And in a lot of ways, just that realization made real the strangeness of just how close in this world genuine goodness and genuine evil exist side by side. I mean, awful stuff is going on out there right now. And it's maybe closer than we are aware of. And, we're probably just kind of sitting here kidding ourselves if we think it's not. I mean, just turn on the news this morning, right? I think this is one of the facts of human life that our gospel recognizes today. We hear this gospel, and it's like we're watching an episode of Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad, or we're listening to the In the Red Clay. We hear this gospel, and we say the gospel is the good news. Well, with good news like this, who needs bad, right? And so to find, I think, the good news in what we have just heard, what that takes is maybe taking a step back, putting this into some context, and kind of look at how this beheading of John fits within the larger narrative of Mark's gospel. So if we look back over the past few weeks, if we've been following along here in our lessons, our gospel at church, we've been hearing about how Jesus and the disciples have been, they've been traveling around the countryside, the region, doing deeds of power and healing and performing miracles. And then last week in our story, remember, it kind of ended with Jesus sending out the disciples. In pairs, he gives them instructions on what to take, what to wear, how to be received as guests. And then next week we'll hear about how his disciples come back, how they return. And then they're just like busier than ever. They don't have time to eat. And so right in the middle of all of this, life and work and ministry and family, right in the middle of the busyness of life, the gospel inserts tragedy and evil, like on a Greek tragedy scale. And so it's notable that sandwiched right in the middle of all the good that is going on, we find family dysfunction. We find a story of people abusing power. We find a story of tragic death. Today we hear how a good person, a prophet's life is ended. I mean, this man, think about it, this was Jesus' relative. This is his cousin, might have grown up with him. Maybe this was a mentor to Jesus. And so the storyline in Mark's gospel, it's like it takes a little time out for tragedy. In the middle of Jesus doing life and work and ministry, suddenly tragedy strikes. And it feels, when you read this, it feels abrupt. It feels out of place. Why is that there, right? And so I really think that this is a very good example of how the gospel is relatable to our life. It's honest. When tragedy strikes us, it usually feels abrupt. It usually feels out of place. That's the life on earth that we know. The Christian Gospels are more than just wise teachings and parables and walking on water. The Gospels contain tears, loss, because our lives contain tragedy and loss. In the gospel, the Jesus movement and Herod's court exist side by side. Just like the Dixie Mafia and Little St. Anthony's Winder were at work right next door. One thing you can say about the gospel is that they keep it real. They name what is. And I think, always we need to remember and maybe find some comfort in the fact that even Jesus, even the life of Jesus, even God in the flesh, that life contains heartbreak and pain and loss. And so with that, what part of us makes us think that maybe we should be immune to that side of life? It just is. I think sometimes, we can kind of get to thinking that, in the back of our minds, if I live just right, or maybe if I pray hard enough, whatever, I can avoid, or maybe I can rise above, and I won't have to go through that sorrow, pain, hurt. Or, when life deals us that blow, it's then that we ask that question, God, what did I do to deserve this? What did I do? So let us remember, as Christians, we're the ones who say that Jesus did everything right. He was without sin. He did everything right. And yet, even the most pure and noble life, maybe that has ever lived, that life knew pain and knew loss. When his cousin was beheaded, that had to hurt. When his dear friend Lazarus died, he wept. And the betrayal of Judas, ouch. We know that hurts. We've gotten, I think, into a Christological rut in many ways where the cross is concerned. And what I mean here is that, we've gotten really good, I think, as a religion at thinking about the pain and death and the suffering on the cross. And we forget that Jesus knew pain and sorrow all along. All throughout his life. Jesus knew and shared our mortal pain, not just on the cross, but throughout his life. And so this means that God knows our pain deeply. The Holy Scriptures do not gloss over. They speak openly about the messiness of life, and God is right there in the middle with us. And the good news we take comfort in is that the Scriptures, all of them, are very clear that God does not abandon us. Our Gospels do not teach us how to avoid or escape tragedy. They teach us how to live in the face of tragedy. They teach us how to live with the pain and the sickness and the death and the sin of this world. Our Scriptures, they remind us again and again in the face of all the hurt and pain how we are to be together and come together and to heal one another and to comfort, to give hope, to lift up, to forgive, to strive for justice and peace. And when tragedy strikes, we come together. We're here for one another. If you read Mark's gospel, it's really interesting here to notice the movement of the disciples. Jesus sends them out, and then he gets the phone call, your cousin John. And then what's the very next thing that we will hear next week? The disciples surround him. That's the movement. That's the model. And this is one of the beautiful things that I see as a priest in the church kind of day in and day out. It's where when we get the bad news, when we get the diagnosis, when there's death, the community instantly surrounds. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so this is the love that surrounds, it's the love that overcomes the evil and death. I have a friend in Davidson who's a singer-songwriter. His name is Paul Atkinson. This is kind of my last thought here. And so Paul and I were drinking a beer out behind Summit Coffee. And his family was in the middle of some real tragedy. His nephew actually had a terminal brain tumor. And I remember he was telling me just how hard. And at the same time, it was one of those, those beautiful early fall evenings where it's a little crisp and the golden light's just kind of coming in at you sideways. And we kind of the conversation paused, and Paul used a word that I hadn't heard before. Maybe you've heard it. But he kind of named the moment. He said, "Isn't life brutiful? Brutiful. Isn't it, though?" We live in a world where hardship and evil exist right beside all the beauty and all the blessings of this life. The serial killer, Billy Burt, was committing unspeakable evil right next to where I was baptized at St. Anthony's. The pool hall that he owned as kind of a front to their operations, that was a block away from the St. Anthony's food pantry. Herod cuts off John's head, and the gospel puts that story right in the middle of telling all the wonderful things, all the loving, life-giving deeds of Jesus. The good news, the gospel, is an acknowledgement of the world we live in. And it's our way, our path to overcoming tragedy. Life is brutal.